The sun was dipping low over the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the rugged plains of New Mexico. Jack Cartwright urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves kicking up puffs of dry dust with every step. Sweat dripped from Jack's brow, a mix of exhaustion and the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. He wasn't just a man riding the open range. He was a fugitive, running from the law and from the ghosts of his past. He wasn't an outlaw by choice. Jack never killed that man, though the whole county thought otherwise. The man had been a friend, or so Jack thought, until greed got in the way. Accused of murder and robbery, Jack had fled, leaving everything behind. His name, his home, the life he once had, all shattered by lies. Now, in the fading light, the vast desert stretched endlessly before him, offering no place to hide, no shelter from the troubles that chased him. His mind raced, not just with fear of being caught, but with guilt gnawing at the edges of his conscience. Could he have done something different? Should he have stood his ground instead of running? The questions lingered unanswered as the sun slowly dipped below the horizon. The first howl caught Jack's attention. It was distant, carried by the wind, but there was something off about it. Coyotes often roamed these parts, their cries filling the night, but this sounded different, darker, unnatural. Jack slowed Lucy, her ears twitching nervously as if sensing the danger he had missed. He scanned the horizon once more, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, his instincts told him something was wrong. Another howl, closer this time, made Jack's grip tighten on the reins. He wasn't a man prone to fear. Life on the frontier had made him hard, cautious, but this was different. His heart raced in his chest as the unsettling quiet of the desert settled in around him. The normal sounds of the plains, crickets, birds, the rustling wind, had gone silent. An oppressive stillness hung in the air. "Easy, girl," Jack muttered, patting Lucy's neck, though his own anxiety was rising. She snorted and shifted her weight uneasily, her muscles tense beneath him. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible in the fading light. It moved fast, darting between the rocks and scrub brush. Jack strained his eyes to follow it, but each time he thought he had it pinned, the shape seemed to disappear, only to reappear somewhere else. His pulse quickened as the shadow grew closer, always just out of sight. "Damn it," Jack whispered under his breath, drawing his pistol. He wasn't sure what he was dealing with, but he knew enough about the land to recognize when things weren't natural. There were stories, old, terrible stories, about creatures that stalked these lands at night. He'd never believed them before, but now, with darkness creeping in, doubt began to settle in his mind. Suddenly, Lucy reared back, nearly throwing Jack from the saddle. He grabbed the reins, struggling to calm her down. That's when he saw it, clearly this time. A coyote, standing atop a nearby ridge, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Jack froze, his hand gripping the revolver tightly. The coyote watched him, unmoving, its eyes boring into his. There was intelligence in those eyes, something far beyond any normal animal. Without warning, the coyote vanished, darting off into the night. Jack barely had time to react before another howl split the silence, much closer now. It wasn't just one howl. It was a chorus, echoing from all directions, closing in on him. "Let's go, girl," Jack urged, kicking Lucy into motion. They bolted forward, the landscape blurring around them. But no matter how fast they rode, the howls followed, always just behind. Panic rose in Jack's chest. He could feel it now. Something wasn't right. The air was thick with a presence he couldn't explain, and no matter how far he rode, it felt like the darkness itself was chasing him. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement again. This time, it wasn't a coyote. It was an owl, its wings silent as it soared overhead, but its eyes, those same glowing, unnatural eyes. Jack's heart pounded. His hand shook as he held his pistol, ready for whatever might come next. The owl disappeared into the night, leaving only the sound of Lucy's hooves pounding against the dirt and Jack's ragged breathing. But the howls remained, ever present, hunting him. "I've got to get out of here," Jack muttered, pushing Lucy harder. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he was facing. It couldn't be a pack of wild animals. This was something else, something out of the old stories he'd once laughed off. Skinwalkers. The thought chilled him to his core, but it was the only explanation that made sense. Whatever it was hunting him, and it wasn't going to stop. As the last remnants of daylight disappeared, Jack felt truly alone in the dark. He knew he couldn't outrun this thing forever. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he scanned the horizon for a place to take cover, somewhere he could make his last stand. But there was nothing. Just the endless, desolate plains stretching out before him like a cruel, empty promise. The howls drew closer, surrounding him. Jack gritted his teeth, his eyes darting in every direction. He wasn't ready to die. Not like this. Not after everything he'd been through. He'd fought too hard, run too far. But the cold hand of fate seemed to be tightening around him, and for the first time, Jack Cartwright, fugitive, fighter, survivor, began to wonder if this was the end. Night had fully descended on the plains, swallowing Jack Cartwright in a sea of darkness. The moon, hidden behind thick clouds, cast no light on the dry, barren land. The only sound breaking the oppressive silence was the rhythmic pounding of Lucy's hooves as Jack urged his horse to go faster. But no matter how hard he rode, the feeling of being hunted clung to him, suffocating him in a way no bounty hunter ever had. The howls were getting closer. Jack's heart raced as he struggled to keep his focus. He wasn't sure where he was going anymore. The landscape had become an unrecognizable blur of shadows and distant shapes. Everything felt hostile now, like the land itself was conspiring against him. Lucy was growing more agitated, her muscles tense, her breathing labored. She knew they were being followed too. In the distance, Jack saw a low ridge cutting across the horizon. His instincts screamed at him to make for it, to find some higher ground, somewhere defensible. He didn't know what was hunting him, but he knew it was something unnatural. He could feel it in his bones. He pulled back on Lucy's reins, directing her toward the ridge, hoping it would offer some form of sanctuary. As they approached, Jack glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see a pack of glowing-eyed coyotes closing in on him. But there was nothing, only the empty stretch of desert. Then he saw it again, the shadow. It moved faster than any animal had a right to. One moment it was on the ground. The next it was slipping between rocks and brush like smoke. Jack's hand instinctively reached for his revolver, though he knew bullets wouldn't do much against whatever this was. A low growl rumbled from the darkness, deeper and more menacing than any coyote Jack had ever heard. Lucy stumbled, her nerves on edge, and Jack had to fight to keep control of her. His heart was hammering in his chest as the growls turned into a chorus of unnatural sounds. A mix of human-like wails and animalistic snarls that made Jack's blood run cold. He reached the base of the ridge, dismounting quickly. His legs trembled from the ride, but he forced himself to stay upright. Pulling Lucy along, he scrambled up the rocks, glancing back only to see the shadow darting closer. He caught a glimpse of glowing eyes. Those same unsettling, otherworldly eyes he'd seen in the coyote and the owl. "It's real," Jack muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The stories of the Skinwalker weren't just campfire tales to scare greenhorns. It was here, and it wanted him. At the top of the ridge, Jack found a narrow crevice between two boulders. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He pulled Lucy into the crevice, patting her neck to calm her down as he peered into the darkness below. His hand rested on the hilt of his revolver, though he knew the gun would be useless against whatever dark magic was hunting him. The wind howled through the rocks, carrying with it the scent of decay. Jack's breath hitched as he caught a glimpse of movement below. The shadow was shifting again, no longer a coyote or an owl, but something larger, more menacing. Its form seemed to twist and contort as it moved, like it was struggling to maintain a shape. At one point, Jack could have sworn it looked human, if only for a second. The creature paused at the base of the ridge, its glowing eyes fixed on Jack's hiding spot. It let out a low, guttural growl that made Lucy tremble, and for a moment, Jack felt a chill settle deep in his bones. He'd heard stories of skinwalkers before, how they could take the shape of animals, how they hunted in the night. But nothing had prepared him for this. He watched in horror as the creature began to climb, its movements slow and deliberate. It was stalking him, savoring the chase, and Jack knew he had nowhere left to run. His grip tightened on his revolver, but in his gut, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The skinwalker stopped halfway up the ridge, its glowing eyes never leaving Jack's. It let out another howl, this one longer, more haunting. Jack's chest tightened as the howl seemed to stretch across the plains, echoing back in distorted waves. Then, in a flash, the creature disappeared. Jack blinked, his eyes scanning the darkness, but the skinwalker was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Lucy's labored breathing. For a moment, Jack thought maybe it had left, that perhaps it had decided to give up the hunt. But deep down, he knew better. Suddenly, a sharp, unnatural screech split the air above him. Jack whipped around, his eyes searching the night sky. He saw the owl again, its wingspan enormous, its glowing eyes locked onto him. The screech echoed off the rocks, rattling in Jack's ears as the owl dove toward him, its talons outstretched. Jack fired his revolver. The shot rang out in the stillness, but the owl simply vanished before the bullet even reached it, as if it had never been there. Panic surged through Jack as he realized just how outmatched he was. The skinwalker was toying with him, making him expend his energy, wearing him down. It was all part of the hunt, and Jack was the prey. The growling resumed, this time from behind him. Jack spun, revolver ready, but the shadow was already closing in. It lunged at him, its twisted from a blur of fur, feathers, and limbs that didn't belong together. Jack fired again and again, but each shot missed as the creature slipped through the shadows like smoke. With a final snarl, the skinwalker charged. Jack braced himself for impact, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop it. His heart pounded in his chest as the creature's glowing eyes bore down on him. And for the first time in years, Jack felt real fear. Fear that this was it, that he'd run his last mile and his fate was sealed. But just as the creature was about to strike, something else emerged from the darkness. A faint glow appeared on the horizon, growing brighter by the second. Jack squinted through the night, his breath catching in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. A rider, mounted on a horse as pale as the moon, was charging toward him. The figure was ghostly, its outline blurred and shimmering in the moonlight, but it was real. The ghostly rider let out a chilling battle cry, brandishing a glowing dagger as it closed in on the skinwalker. The creature let out a hideous scream, retreating into the shadows as the rider pursued it, slashing at the air with its ethereal blade. Jack stood frozen in disbelief, watching as the spectral figure fought off the skinwalker with an almost otherworldly skill. The creature, for all its dark magic, seemed powerless against the rider, its form dissolving into smoke with each strike of the glowing dagger. Within moments, the skinwalker was gone, retreating into the night like a vanquished nightmare. The air was still once again, and the ghostly rider sat tall on their horse, their face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Jack stared in awe, his heart still racing. The rider turned to face him, and for the first time in his life, Jack felt truly helpless. Whoever, or whatever, this rider was, they had just saved his life. But why? The rider gestured for Jack to follow, their ghostly form glowing faintly in the moonlight. Jack, still reeling from the encounter, hesitated only for a moment before climbing back onto Lucy. With no other choice, he urged his horse forward, following the silent rider into the dark unknown. The night seemed even darker as Jack Cartwright followed the ghostly rider across the barren plains. The spectral figure ahead of him glowed faintly, casting an eerie light that barely cut through the surrounding shadows. Jack's mind raced, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The Skinwalker, the attack, and now this rider, who had appeared from nowhere, wielding a glowing dagger, had saved his life. But the question gnawed at him. Why? Lucy trotted hesitantly behind the ghostly horse, her usual unease at the presence of predators now replaced by a quiet acceptance of the rider's supernatural nature. Jack didn't know if it was fear or exhaustion that kept his horse calm, but he wasn't about to complain. He, too, was feeling the weight of everything that had happened, his muscles aching and his nerves on edge. But he couldn't shake the sense that something bigger was coming, something worse. The rider never looked back. Cloaked in shadows, the figure seemed almost weightless as they rode, their wide-brimmed hat casting a deep shadow over their face. Jack had caught only a glimpse of the glowing dagger as the rider had struck down the Skinwalker, but the memory of it stayed sharp in his mind. There was something unnatural about it, something cursed. The wind howled across the plains, but the rider made no sound, no words. The quiet was unnerving. Jack wasn't used to silence. Usually, there was at least the sound of the wind or the distant calls of animals. But now, the world seemed devoid of life. Only the faint sound of hooves on dirt and the occasional creak of leather broke the stillness. "Who are you?" Jack finally called out, his voice barely more than a rasp in the quiet night. The rider gave no answer, continuing forward as if Jack hadn't spoken at all. The longer they rode, the more the landscape shifted. What had once been open plains now became rough, broken terrain. Sharp rocks jutted from the earth, and twisted, dead trees dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels. Jack felt a growing unease in his gut. This wasn't just the desert. They were heading into a place that felt cursed. Jack's mind wandered back to the stories he'd heard as a boy, sitting around campfires with other cowboys. There were always whispers of cursed lands, places where ancient spirits roamed, where dark magic lingered in the air like a plague. He never put much stock in those tales. Until now. The rider suddenly stopped at the crest of a small hill. Jack pulled Lucy to a halt beside them, glancing around the desolate landscape. In the distance, he could see a series of low hills, their shapes illuminated faintly by the hidden moon. But there was something else, too. Just beyond the hills, a structure. A small abandoned homestead. The rider gestured toward the homestead, the silent command clear. Jack hesitated for a moment, but something told him this was where he needed to go. Slowly, he nudged Lucy forward, making his way toward the abandoned house. As they approached, the details of the place became clearer. The homestead was old, ancient, really. The wood was splintered and weathered, worn down by decades of exposure to the harsh desert. A broken-down fence surrounded the place, the gate hanging by a single rusted hinge. The windows were empty, the glass long shattered, and the door hung crookedly in its frame. Jack dismounted, his boots crunching in the dirt, as he led Lucy toward what remained of the porch. The air was thick here, heavy with the weight of years gone by. Jack could feel it, the sense that this place held secrets, dark ones. He turned to look back at the rider, but they hadn't moved. The ghostly figure watched from the hilltop, still as a statue. Jack wasn't sure what to make of it. Was this a warning? A test? Either way, he couldn't turn back now. He had come this far. Jack stepped up onto the creaking porch, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver. The door swung open with a soft groan as he pushed it, revealing the inside of the homestead. Dust and debris covered the floor, and cobwebs draped the corners of the room like curtains. In the center of the room, there was an old, worn chair, broken but still standing. As he stepped inside, something caught Jack's eye. On the wall, half covered in dust and grime, hung a faded photograph. Jack moved closer, his heart beating a little faster as he wiped the dust away. It was a portrait, an old one, likely from decades ago. And in it, a man sat on a horse, his face partially shadowed by a familiar wide-brimmed hat. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The man in the photograph. It was him, the rider. But there was something else. Something even more unsettling. It was Jack's grandfather. He had heard stories about his grandfather, a cowboy who had mysteriously disappeared years before Jack was even born. The man had ridden out one day and never returned, vanishing into the desert like a ghost. No one had ever found a trace of him, and the story had become legend in Jack's family. But Jack never believed it. Until now. His mind raced. Could this ghostly rider, the figure that had saved him, truly be his grandfather? And if so, why was he here after all these years? The creak of wood behind him snapped Jack from his thoughts. He spun around, revolver drawn, but the doorway was empty. Only the soft glow of the rider, still standing on the hill, broke the darkness. Suddenly, the air grew colder. Jack's fingers tightened on his gun as he felt a presence, something dark, something ancient. The homestead wasn't abandoned, not entirely. The wind outside picked up, rattling the broken windows, and Jack felt the weight of the curse in the air. His grandfather had brought him here for a reason, and whatever it was, Jack wasn't sure he wanted to know. He stepped back out onto the porch, his eyes locked on the rider. The ghostly figure hadn't moved, still watching from a distance. Jack took a deep breath, his mind filled with questions. Why had his grandfather returned now, and what did this cursed land have to do with him? As Jack mounted Lucy, ready to ride back to the rider, he felt a strange sense of destiny pulling him forward. His fate was tied to his grandfather's, whether he liked it or not. The rider turned, leading Jack back into the desert without a word, their ghostly form fading into the night. Jack followed, knowing there were answers ahead, even if those answers would change everything. Jack followed the ghostly rider through the darkened plains, the air growing colder with every passing mile. The pale figure rode silently ahead, casting a dim glow that barely illuminated the path in front of them. Jack felt the heavy weight of the revelation sinking in. The rider was his grandfather, a man he had never met but whose stories of mystery and disappearance had haunted his family for generations. But now, something far darker gnawed at Jack's mind. Why had his grandfather returned from the dead? What had brought him back to this cursed land? And what did it mean for Jack? The eerie silence that surrounded them felt oppressive. The wind no longer howled, and even the distant cries of nocturnal animals had vanished. Jack glanced up at the sky, where the moon hid behind thick clouds, casting the land in a shadowy darkness. It felt like the entire world had been swallowed by something unnatural, something Jack couldn't fully comprehend. Lucy, ever faithful, trotted behind the spectral horse, her usual skittishness tempered by an unnerving calm. Jack could feel her muscles twitching beneath him, but she followed without hesitation, just as Jack did. Neither of them had a choice anymore. As they rode, Jack couldn't stop thinking about the photograph he'd found in the old homestead, the faded image of his grandfather. His mind churned with questions. What had happened to the man? Why had he vanished all those years ago, only to return now as this ghostly rider? And why had he saved Jack from the Skinwalker? The answer, Jack knew, was tied to the cursed dagger the rider had wielded. There was something ancient about it, something powerful and malevolent. And Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this journey wasn't just about escaping the Skinwalker. It was about something much more dangerous. After what felt like hours of riding through the barren landscape, the ghostly rider slowed to a stop. Jack reined in Lucy beside him, his heart pounding with anticipation. They had arrived at a place unlike any Jack had ever seen. Before them lay a barren canyon, its jagged cliffs rising like broken teeth against the dark sky. The land here was dead. No trees, no animals, not even a blade of grass. Just lifeless dirt and rocks, as if the earth itself had been cursed. In the center of the canyon was a large stone altar, worn down by time but still imposing, as if it had been carved by hands far older than anything Jack had ever known. The rider dismounted, moving silently toward the altar. Jack hesitated but followed, his boots crunching on the dry ground. The air felt thick here, heavy with a malevolent energy that made it hard to breathe. Every instinct in Jack's body screamed at him to turn back, to ride away from this place and never look back. But he couldn't. Not now. Not with his grandfather waiting for him at the edge of this cursed place. As he approached the altar, Jack noticed carvings etched into the stone, symbols he didn't recognize. Ancient, twisted shapes that seemed to pulse with an unseen force. The language of a time long forgotten, perhaps even older than the tribes that had once roamed these lands. The rider stood at the edge of the altar, his glowing form casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. He still hadn't spoken a word, but Jack could feel the weight of his presence. His grandfather was waiting for something Jack wasn't sure he was ready to give. "Why'd you bring me here?" Jack's voice was low, filled with a mix of curiosity and fear. "What is this place?" The rider finally moved. Slowly, almost deliberately, he reached into the folds of his ghostly cloak and pulled out the dagger. The cursed blade glinted in the faint light, its edges sharp and deadly. Jack took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver, though he knew it would be useless against the ghostly figure. The rider held the dagger out, the blade shimmering with an otherworldly glow. Jack stared at it, his heart pounding. He could feel the dark energy radiating from the weapon, a curse so powerful it seemed to vibrate in the air around them. "That dagger," Jack whispered, his throat dry. "What is it?" The rider still didn't speak, but he took a step forward, holding the dagger closer to Jack. Jack's pulse quickened as he backed away, the feeling of dread growing stronger with each passing second. "You saved me from the Skinwalker," Jack said, his voice shaking slightly. "But why? What do you want from me?" The rider stopped, standing just inches from Jack now. He raised the dagger, holding it above his head as if preparing for something. Something Jack didn't want to think about. The wind picked up again, swirling around them like a living force. Jack could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, suffocating him. His heart raced as he stared into the ghostly rider's shadowed face, trying to find some trace of the man he had once been. His grandfather, the cowboy who had disappeared so long ago. But there was nothing there. No humanity. Only the cold, empty void of something far darker. And then, without warning, the rider spoke. "Your fate is sealed." The voice was low, guttural, and not entirely human. Jack's blood turned to ice as the words echoed in the canyon, reverberating off the stone walls like a death knell. Before Jack could react, the rider plunged the dagger toward him. He stumbled, gasping for breath as the world around him seemed to warp and twist. The stars above blurred, and the ground beneath him tilted as if reality itself was unraveling. Jack collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest as the rider stood over him, the dagger still glowing with a sickly light. But as Jack's vision faded, something strange happened. His body didn't die. Instead, he felt himself changing. His skin, his bones, his very essence began to shift, becoming lighter, less solid. His breath slowed, his heartbeat fading until it was nothing more than a distant echo. Jack looked up at the rider, his vision hazy. The ghostly figure was fading, dissolving into the air like smoke. And then In its place, Jack saw the truth. The rider wasn't disappearing. He was passing on the curse. As Jack's body transformed into something ethereal, he realized the terrible truth. The rider, his grandfather, had been bound to this curse for decades, forced to roam the desert as a ghostly figure, defending the land from the Skinwalkers and other dark forces. And now, that curse had been passed on to Jack. The old rider vanished completely, leaving Jack alone at the altar. The pale horse stood beside him, unchanged, still bound by the same curse. Jack felt the weight of eternity settle on his shoulders as he stood, his body now a ghostly reflection of the man he had once been. The dagger remained in his hand, glowing faintly in the night. Jack Cartwright was now the new ghostly rider. He mounted the horse, knowing what his fate was. Forever bound to this cursed land, he would ride the plains, protecting the living from the creatures that lurked in the shadows, until the curse was passed on once again. With a final glance at the canyon, Jack turned his horse toward the horizon, and together they disappeared into the night. The night stretched endlessly before Jack Cartwright, now a shadow of the man he had once been. His body, once flesh and bone, was now ghostly, an ethereal form bound to the cursed plains. As he rode through the desert on the spectral horse, his mind struggled to process the events that had just unfolded. The weight of eternity pressed down on him, a burden far heavier than anything he had ever imagined. The dagger in his hand still pulsed with the dark energy of the curse. Its blade glowed faintly, casting a sickly light that illuminated the barren landscape. Jack stared at it, feeling the malevolent power that now coursed through him. The dagger wasn't just a weapon. It was a bond, a tether that tied him to the land and the curse that had claimed his grandfather before him. He looked down at the pale horse beneath him. The animal, like Jack, was cursed to roam these desolate lands for eternity, forever bound to its rider. Its glowing eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the same unnatural light as the dagger. Jack felt a pang of sorrow for the creature, knowing that it too was trapped in this eternal cycle. Neither of them had a choice in this fate. The wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the faint echoes of distant cries. Jack could sense them now, things lurking just beyond the edges of his perception. Dark creatures, like the Skinwalker, that roamed the night, preying on the living. He had been blind to their presence before, but now, as a ghostly rider, he could feel them all around him. They were watching, waiting. He urged the horse forward, riding deeper into the desert. The world around him felt different now, emptier, colder. Even the stars above seemed dimmer, as if the very light of the heavens couldn't touch this cursed place. Jack's thoughts were a swirl of confusion, anger, and fear. How had it come to this? How had his life, once so full of promise, ended in this nightmare? The answer was the dagger. Jack's mind drifted back to the moment when his grandfather had plunged the cursed blade into his chest. The pain had been unlike anything he'd ever felt, but it wasn't just physical. It was as if the dagger had reached into his soul and torn it apart, binding him to this fate. The curse, passed down through generations, had claimed him just as it had claimed his grandfather. But why? Why had his family been cursed in the first place? Jack pulled on the reins, bringing the horse to a stop at the edge of a deep ravine. The land here was even more desolate than before, the earth cracked and barren. He dismounted, his boots touching the ground without a sound. The spectral nature of his form made everything feel distant, as though he were no longer a part of the physical world. He held the dagger up to the faint moonlight, inspecting the ancient symbols etched into the blade. They were unlike anything Jack had ever seen. Twisted, unnatural shapes that seemed to shift and move as he stared at them. He could feel the curse pulsing through the dagger, a dark magic older than time itself. The stories he'd heard growing up, about ancient shamans and cursed lands, flooded back into his mind. He had always dismissed them as legends, But now he understood. The curse was real, and it had been placed on the dagger by an ancient Indian shaman long ago. The shaman, betrayed by those he had once trusted, had bound his rage and sorrow into the blade, ensuring that whoever wielded it would carry the weight of his vengeance for all eternity. And now, that burden rested on Jack's shoulders. The horse snorted softly beside him, its glowing eyes scanning the horizon. Jack could feel the presence of something nearby. His senses, sharpened by the curse, picked up the faint stirrings of a dark force. Another Skinwalker, perhaps, or something even worse. He knew he would face many of them now. It was his duty, his curse, to protect the living from the darkness that crept through the night. But Jack wasn't ready to accept it, not yet. He knelt by the edge of the ravine, staring down into the abyss. The cold wind whipped around him, tugging at his ghostly form. He still felt the remnants of his old self. The man who had once been alive, who had once ridden these lands as a flesh-and-blood cowboy. He longed for that life again, to feel the warmth of the sun on his face, to breathe the fresh air of the open plains. But those days were gone. He was something else now. Something cursed. The dagger pulsed in his hand, a constant reminder of the dark magic that had claimed him. He wanted to throw it into the ravine, to rid himself of the cursed blade once and for all. But he knew that wouldn't work. The dagger was bound to him, just as he was bound to it. There was no escaping the curse. With a sigh, Jack stood and sheathed the dagger. He had to keep moving. There was no telling what was out there in the darkness, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. The creatures of the night would come for him, just as they had come for his grandfather. And when they did, he would be ready. Jack mounted the horse again, the animal's pale form glowing faintly in the moonlight. Together, they rode along the edge of the ravine, the wind howling in their ears. Jack's mind wandered back to his grandfather, the man who had carried this curse for so long. Had he felt the same fear? The same anger? Jack would never know. As they rode, Jack began to feel the presence of another creature, lurking just beyond his sight. His grip tightened on the reins, his body tensing. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel its hunger, its malevolent energy. The dagger pulsed in response, ready for the battle to come. This was his life now. The ghostly rider and his cursed horse disappeared into the night, ready to face whatever dark force awaited them. The landscape had become a familiar sight to Jack, though it had only been a short time since his transformation. The barren plains, once vast and lonely, now felt like an eternal prison. The cursed dagger at his side pulsed faintly, as if reminding him of the responsibility he could never escape. The pale horse beneath him, just as bound by the curse, moved through the darkness with an unnatural grace. Together, they were the new sentinels of the night, destined to hunt the creatures that haunted the land. Jack Cartwright, the fugitive cowboy, was gone. What remained was something else. Something cursed. A ghostly rider forever tied to a fate he hadn't chosen. The wind howled around him, carrying the distant sound of creatures stirring in the shadows. Jack could feel them now. The skinwalkers and darker things lurking at the edges of the living world, hunting their prey. He knew they sensed him too. He wasn't just their hunter. He was part of the same supernatural world they inhabited. His form might be different, but the curse had made him part of the dark magic that permeated these plains. As he rode, Jack's mind drifted to thoughts of the men who had wronged him, the ones who had framed him for murder and robbery. The old Jack would have sought revenge, but now, those earthly matters seemed trivial. His life was no longer about justice or survival. His purpose was now tied to something far more ancient, far more terrifying. He rode without a destination, guided by instincts he didn't fully understand. The curse pulled him in directions he hadn't known existed. It was as if the land itself whispered to him, leading him to the places where darkness festered. Jack was no longer free to choose his path. The curse controlled him now. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time had begun to lose its meaning. Jack could no longer track the passage of time in the way he once did. He felt no hunger, no thirst, only the steady pull of the cursed dagger at his side, urging him forward, deeper into the night. The creature lurked in the distance, just beyond his sight, but Jack knew it was there. It had been tracking him, perhaps curious about this new ghostly figure who had taken the place of his grandfather. The Skinwalker likely wondered if this new rider was as skilled as deadly. Jack's hand moved to the hilt of the cursed dagger. The weapon felt alive beneath his fingers, pulsing with dark energy as if eager for the coming battle. The curse that bound him and the dagger also empowered him, making him more than just a ghostly figure. Jack wasn't afraid. He was ready. Without warning, the Skinwalker revealed itself, bursting from the shadows in a blur of fur and claws. It shifted forms as it ran. One moment a coyote, the next a great horned owl, and then something monstrous, a combination of human and beast. Its glowing eyes locked onto Jack, and it let out a bone-chilling howl. Jack pulled the dagger free from its sheath, the blade glowing with an unnatural light. The Skinwalker charged, but Jack was faster. His pale horse surged forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. Jack slashed at the creature, the cursed blade humming with power as it cut through the Skinwalker's twisted form. The Skinwalker screamed, a sound that echoed through the plains, but it didn't retreat. It twisted and lunged at Jack, its claws reaching for him. Jack moved like a shadow, dodging the creature's attacks with ease. The curse had made him faster, stronger. He wasn't the same man who had once fled from this creature in terror. He was something far worse now. A predator just like the Skinwalker. The battle raged across the darkened landscape. The Skinwalker, shifting forms in a desperate attempt to escape the cursed blade. But Jack wouldn't let it. He had been chosen for this, bound to fight these creatures for all eternity, and he would not fail. With a final, swift motion, Jack plunged the dagger into the creature's chest. The Skinwalker let out a final dying wail as its body dissolved into a cloud of smoke. The wind carried its ashes away, leaving nothing behind but the silence of the plains. Jack sat on his pale horse, the dagger still glowing in his hand. The battle was over, but there would be more. The darkness that crept through these lands was vast, and Jack knew his task was far from complete. He sheathed the dagger and urged the horse forward once again, his ghostly form slipping back into the shadows. But as Jack rode, something strange began to happen. The land around him started to shift, the edges of his vision blurring like a dream. The wind carried strange whispers, voices that Jack couldn't understand. He slowed the horse, his instincts warning him that something was wrong. The world seemed to tilt beneath him, the ground shifting in ways that defied nature. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the horizon. A man on horseback, just like Jack. But this rider was not a ghostly figure. He was real, flesh and blood. Jack watched as the man approached, his form becoming clearer with each step. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat, his face shadowed, but Jack could sense his presence. A powerful force that seemed to hum with the same dark energy as the cursed dagger. Jack realized with a start who it was, his grandfather. But not the ghostly figure who had cursed at him. This was his grandfather as he had been in life, whole, strong, and commanding. The living version of the man who had vanished so many years ago. The two riders faced each other in the middle of the barren plains, a spectral Jack and his living ancestor. Jack's heart pounded, but he couldn't speak. His grandfather's eyes gleamed with something Jack couldn't quite read. Was it regret? Anger? Or acceptance of the fate that had been passed down to them both? Without a word, Jack's grandfather turned his horse and began to ride away, disappearing into the distance. Jack watched him go, his chest tightening with the realization that his grandfather was showing him the truth. The man had been bound to the same fate, cursed to ride these lands as Jack now did. They were connected by the same curse, by the same dark magic, but Jack was the one who had to carry it now. The image of his grandfather faded into the night, leaving Jack alone once again. He took a deep breath, the weight of his new existence settling over him like a heavy shroud. He was the new ghostly rider now, the bearer of the cursed dagger, the protector of the living against the creatures that lurked in the dark. His fate was sealed, and there was no escaping it. With a final glance at the horizon, Jack urged the pale horse forward. Together, they disappeared into the night, bound to the land, the curse, and the endless battle that awaited them. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping tales and deep dives into the mysteries of folklore and the supernatural. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about the story. Feel free to share them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the unknown.